The most dangerous place in the world isn't a dark alleyway. It's right in front of everyone's eyes, where they choose not to look. Zara Bennett believed that if she stayed small and kept her head down, she could survive long enough to find her brother. She never expected that her invisibility would be shattered by the most feared man in Seoul, or that he had been looking for her all along. Scrubbing the Italian marble floors of the Grand Seoul Hotel required a specific rhythm, a steady, circular motion that kept Zara's eyes fixed on the dirt, rather than the diamonds walking past her. She had mastered the art of becoming part of the furniture, blending into the gold-leafed pillars until she was just another shadow in the lobby. For Zara, being ignored wasn't an insult, it was a shield. Invisibility kept her safe from the questions she couldn't answer, and more importantly, it kept the meager tips flowing. Every one she earned was a tiny drop in the ocean of debt left behind by her brother's disappearance, a debt that grew larger every time the landlord knocked. She was one broken cleaning cart away from the street, and in a city this cold, the street was a death sentence. Julian Vane, the hotel's owner, didn't know Zara existed, even as his face smiled from the giant digital displays in the lobby. He was a man celebrated for his vision and his grace, a savior of the city's skyline, who hid his rot behind a wall of high-priced security and polished glass. The marble of the Grand Seoul lobby was so cold it felt like ice through the thin rubber of Zara's sneakers. Every morning at 5 a.m., the world was a blur of gray light and the rhythmic shuck-shuck of her brush against the stone. She didn't look up. Looking up meant catching the eyes of guests who viewed her as a glitch in their perfect scenery. Instead, she focused on the reflected glow of the crystal chandeliers in the wet floor. Under the sleeve of her oversized uniform, the metal of her brother's old watch pressed against her wrist. It didn't tick anymore. The glass was cracked, and the leather strap was frayed, but she wore it every day like a lead weight. It was the only thing Julian Vane's men hadn't found when they cleared out her brother's locker 6 months ago. To the hotel, Leo was a resigned employee. To Zara, he was a ghost she was chasing through the service corridors. By noon, the lobby began to breathe. The scent of expensive lilies and filtered air conditioning filled the space. Zara moved to the brass railings near the entrance, polishing cloth in hand. She noticed a shift in the security guards near the revolving doors. They weren't just standing, they were bracing. The usual chatter of the wealthy tourists died down as a fleet of 4 black SUVs pulled into the private drive, their engines a low, synchronized growl. The hotel manager, a man who usually moved with the slow grace of a swan, was suddenly sweating. He adjusted his tie 3 times in 10 seconds. Zara pulled her cart into the shadow of a massive marble pillar, trying to disappear. The heavy doors of the lead vehicle opened. A man stepped out, his tailored black suit absorbing the sunlight. Choi Min-Seok didn't wait for his bodyguards to catch up. He walked with a focused intensity that made the air in the lobby feel thin. Every guest stopped moving. Some even stepped back. Zara kept her head down, her fingers trembling as she gripped the brass railing. She waited for the wave of power to pass her by, for the expensive shoes to click toward the private elevators. But the clicking stopped. The silence was absolute. Zara could hear the faint hum of the watch on her wrist, a sound she knew was impossible, yet it filled her ears. A shadow fell over the patch of marble she had just polished. "You're late with my property, Zara." The voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the room like a blade. Zara's heart hit her ribs. She hadn't told anyone her name. She hadn't told anyone she was Leo's sister. She looked up, and for the first time in 3 years, she forgot to be invisible. Choi was pointing directly at her, his eyes like iron, and the shield she had built around herself shattered in a single breath. The world didn't just go quiet, it seemed to hold its breath. Zara stayed frozen, her hands still clutching the damp polishing rag. She could feel the stares of the wealthy guests, people who had walked past her for months without seeing a human being, now burning into the back of her neck. They weren't looking at a mate anymore. They were looking at a target. Choi Min-Seok didn't lower his hand. He stood a few feet away, his presence taking up all the oxygen in the grand lobby. Behind him, his bodyguards formed a semicircle, their faces unreadable behind dark glass. They didn't look at the crowd. They only looked at the girl with the messy hair and the stained knees. I don't know who you are," Zara whispered. Her voice felt thin and brittle against the vastness of the room. Choi took a step closer. The click of his leather shoes on the marble sounded like a gavel. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had finally found a missing puzzle piece. He leaned in just enough so his words wouldn't carry to the curious ears of the socialites nearby. "Your brother was a very talented man, Zara. But he was also a thief," Choi said softly. The mention of Leo made the watch on Zara's wrist feel 100 pounds heavier. She tried to swallow the lump in her throat, her eyes darting toward the security desk where Julian Vane's head of safety was already reaching for his radio. The pressure was changing. It wasn't just the Mafia boss she had to worry about now. It was the hotel itself. "Leo didn't steal anything," she managed to say, though her pulse was hammering in her fingertips. "He took something from my family. Something that belongs in a vault, not in a locket around the neck of a girl who spends her days cleaning up after people like Vane," Choi replied. He glanced down at the small, cheap silver heart hanging from the chain around her neck. Zara instinctively pulled her collar closed. She had always thought the locket was just a parting gift, a keepsake from the last night she saw Leo alive. She had never opened it. She had never even tried. "The manager is coming," Choi noted, his gaze shifting over her shoulder without an ounce of fear. "You have two choices. You can stay here and let them ask you why a man like me knows your name, or you can walk out those doors with me. If you stay, Vane will make sure you disappear just like your brother did." Zara looked at the exit, then at the hotel security team closing in. The invisibility that had protected her was gone. She looked at Choi's extended hand. It wasn't a gesture of kindness, it was an ultimatum. She dropped the polishing rag into her bucket, stood up, and took the first step toward a life she could never turn back from. The private elevator didn't chime when it reached the penthouse floor. It opened with a soft hiss into a room that felt too large and too quiet. The air here was different, sharp, cold, and smelling of expensive leather. Choi walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, looking out over the Seoul skyline, as if he owned every flickering light in the city. Zara stayed by the door, her fingers still curled around the strap of her bag. Choi gestured toward a velvet chair, but Zara didn't sit. She watched his bodyguards take positions at the corners of the room. They didn't move. They didn't even seem to breathe. "You think Leo was a hero," Choi said, his back still turned. "You think he disappeared because he found out something he shouldn't have." "He was a good person," Zara replied. She looked at her reflection in the dark window. She looked small, her uniform out of place against the gold trim of the suite. Choi turned around. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, high-tech tablet. He tapped the screen, and a grainy security video began to play. It showed the hotel's loading docks from 6 months ago. In the corner of the frame, Leo was moving quickly. He wasn't working. He was handing a small, glowing drive to a man in a hooded jacket. "Leo didn't just work for Vane," Choi explained, his voice low and steady. "He was a courier. He moved high-value data for my syndicate. But on his last night, he got greedy. He took a master encryption key, the kind of key that can unlock the bank accounts of every major player in this city." Zara felt the room tilt. She remembered Leo coming home late, his hands shaking, telling her to never take off the silver locket. He had told her it was a lucky charm. "He didn't steal it for himself," Zara said, her voice rising slightly. "He was scared. He told me he had to protect us." "Protecting you by making you a target?" Choi asked. He stepped closer, the light from the tablet reflecting in his intense eyes. "Vane thinks Leo still has it. That's why your brother is gone. But I know Leo didn't have time to hide it anywhere but on you. A new weight settled on Zara. It wasn't just the memory of her brother anymore. It was the realization that she had been a walking vault for months. I won't give it to you, she said, her voice steadier than she felt. If I give it to you, I have nothing left to trade for his life. Choi leaned in, his expression unreadable. You think he's still alive? That's your first mistake. Your second mistake is thinking Vane hasn't realized the truth yet. Look at the door. Zara looked. Through the crack in the double doors of the suite, she saw a red light blinking on the security panel. The hotel system was being bypassed from the outside. Vane wasn't waiting for her to come down. He was coming up. Zara looked at Choi, then at the locket. For the first time, she realized she wasn't just a maid or a sister. She was the only person who could decide who burned and who survived. The red light on the door panel continued to blink, a silent countdown that seemed to pulse in time with the thumping in Zara's chest. She didn't look at the door again. Instead, her hand moved slowly to the silver heart resting against her collarbone. For 6 months, she had polished this metal with her thumb whenever she missed Leo. She had treated it as a piece of him, a worthless bit of jewelry that was only valuable because of the memory it held. Open it, Choi said. His voice was no longer a command. It was a quiet observation. He remained standing by the window, but his shadow stretched across the floor, reaching her feet. Zara fumbled with the tiny latch. Her nails were short and ragged from weeks of scrubbing, making the task feel impossible. With a sharp click, the heart finally split in two. She expected to see a photo of her brother, or perhaps a lock of hair. Instead, a thin, green sliver of plastic and gold sat embedded in the center of the silver. It was a microchip, no larger than a fingernail. It caught the dim light of the suite, glowing with a cold, digital sharpness. It looked like a foreign object inside a wound. Leo didn't give you a gift, Choi remarked, his eyes fixed on the chip. He gave you a target. That chip contains the ledger for every shipment Julian Vane has moved through this hotel. Human cargo, Zara. Not just electronics or furniture. Zara stared at the tiny piece of technology. The weight she had felt on her wrist earlier was nothing compared to the coldness spreading through her now. She hadn't been mourning her brother in safety. She had been walking through the hotel halls, cleaning Vane's rooms and bowing to his guests, while carrying the one thing that could send him to prison for life. She realized then that every time Vane had looked at her in the hallway, every time his security team had searched her bag, she had been a heartbeat away from being disposed of. He knew, Zara whispered, her voice barely a breath. He knew I was carrying this. That's why he didn't kill me yet. He couldn't find it. He was waiting for you to lead him to it, Choi said. He stepped away from the window, moving toward her with a sudden, sharp focus. And I just led him straight to this room. Outside in the hallway, the sound of heavy boots muffled by the thick carpet grew louder. There was a metallic scrape, the sound of a weapon being readied. Zara looked from the chip to the door, then back to Choi. She took the chip out of the locket. Her hands stopped shaking. The fear was still there, but it was being pushed aside by a new, hard realization. She wasn't just a maid anymore, and she wasn't just a victim. She held the leash. If you want this, Zara said, her voice dropping to a low, steady tone as she looked Choi in the eye, you don't just take it. You help me finish what Leo started. She didn't wait for his answer. She tucked the chip into the secret lining of her brother's watch, snapped the empty locket shut, and stood her ground as the suite doors began to groan under the pressure from the outside. The heavy doors of the penthouse didn't burst open. Instead, they clicked shut from the inside, locked by Choi's men just as the elevator began its descent. Choi didn't take Zara back to the lobby. He used a service key to stop the lift at the 14th floor, the mechanical heart of the hotel. When the doors slid open, the air was thick with the hum of industrial laundry machines and the smell of bleach. Choi didn't follow her out. He stayed in the shadows of the elevator, his face partially obscured. Vane is watching the main exits, Choi said. But he hasn't checked the service tunnels yet. He thinks I've already taken what I want from you. If you can get to the basement archives, you can find the manifest he's trying to hide. My men will create a distraction in the lobby, but in these halls, you are on your own. The elevator doors closed, leaving Zara alone in the dim, flickering light of the corridor. She didn't run. Running created noise. Instead, she adjusted her apron and picked up a stray laundry bin, pushing it slowly in front of her. As she moved toward the south stairwell, she noticed the change. The service corridors, usually filled with gossiping housekeepers and busy porters, were unnervingly empty. The silence was broken only by the squeak of her cart's wheels. Then she saw it, the flash of a black suit at the end of the hall. It wasn't one of Choi's men. This man wore the Silver Eagle pin of the Grand Seoul security team. He wasn't stopping her. He was following. He stayed exactly 20 paces behind, his footsteps perfectly timed with hers. Zara turned into the industrial kitchen prep area. She caught her reflection in a stainless steel fridge and saw a second man appearing from a side exit. They were hurting her. They didn't want to catch her yet. They wanted to see where she was going. They were waiting for her to lead them to the property Choi had mentioned. The pressure in the hallway felt physical, like the air was being sucked out of the room. Zara reached the service elevator that led to the basement archives. She pressed the button, her heart skipping as the light stayed dark. The power to this wing had been cut. She looked back. The two guards were closing the distance, their hands resting on the radios at their belts. Zara realized then that Choi hadn't just given her a chance. He had used her as bait to see how Vane would react. She had to make a choice. If she went to the archives now, she would lead Vane's killers straight to the evidence. She turned abruptly, abandoning her cart, and slipped into the dark, narrow chute of the linen drop. It was a steep, terrifying descent into the unknown, but as she let go, she realized she was no longer just afraid of the eyes in the hallway. She was angry. Vane had taken her brother, and now he was hunting her in the very place she had spent 3 years cleaning. The hunt had started, but Zara was done being the prey. The linen chute deposited Zara into a mountain of damp, heavy towels in the sub-basement. The air was thick with heat from the industrial dryers. Above her, the muffled sound of radio chatter echoed through the metal duct. Vane's men were already searching the laundry room. She didn't have much time. She knew the hotel's layout better than any guest. Beside the giant water heaters was a rusted maintenance hatch. It led to the narrow crawl spaces that carried the building's air and wiring. Zara pulled herself into the vent, the metal groaning softly under her weight. It was cramped and smelled of old dust and electricity. She moved on her hands and knees, following the blue light of the fiber-optic cables that led toward the executive wing. Every time a guest in the rooms below turned on a tap or shut a door, the vibrations rattled Zara's teeth. She kept her eyes on the watch on her wrist, using its cracked face to catch the faint light. Finally, she reached a heavy iron grate. Looking down, she saw the dark mahogany of Julian Vane's private office. The room was empty. Vane was likely in the security hub, coordinating the hunt for her. Zara pushed the grate aside and lowered herself onto the plush velvet carpet. The silence of the office felt heavy like a trap. She didn't go for the safe. She knew Vane wouldn't keep the truth in a place so obvious. She went for the desk, the place where he sat every day, looking down on the city. The drawers were locked, but Zara had spent years watching the maintenance crew. She grabbed a metal letter opener from the desk and pressed it into the seam of the middle drawer. With a dull pop, the lock gave way. She sifted through the papers, bank statements, land deeds, and dinner invitations. Then, shoved into the back of a small wooden tray, her fingers brushed something cold and plastic. She pulled it out. It was a Grand Seoul employee ID card. The photo was of Leo, smiling that half grin he only used when he was nervous. The plastic was stained with a dark, dried substance that wasn't ink. The corner of the card was melted, as if someone had tried to burn it before changing their mind. Zara didn't cry. Her vision went sharp and clear. This was the proof she had been looking for. Leo hadn't resigned. He hadn't moved away. He had bled in this hotel. As she tucked the ID card next to the microchip in her brother's watch, she heard the soft click of the office door's electronic lock. The shadow of a man appeared through the frosted glass. It wasn't Choi. It was Vane. Zara realized then that she didn't want to hide anymore. She stood in the center of the room, the blood-stained ID clutched in her hand, and made a decision. She wasn't leaving this office until Vane knew exactly who she was. The door opened with a heavy thud, and Julian Vane stepped inside. He didn't look like a villain. He looked like a man who had just finished a long day of meetings. He tossed his keys onto the desk and stopped when he saw Zara standing by the window. He didn't scream or call for help. He simply sighed, as if she were a minor inconvenience he had forgotten to clean up. I expected the Mafia to send a professional, not the girl who forgets to dust the baseboards, Vane said. He leaned against the doorframe, blocking the only exit. His eyes dropped to the ID card in Zara's hand. He didn't flinch. Leo was a fool. He thought a conscience was worth more than a salary. I hope you're smarter than he was. Zara felt the cold air from the open vent behind her, but she didn't move toward it. She placed the blood-stained ID card on top of his mahogany desk, right next to his gold pen. It looked like a stain that wouldn't wash out. Choi Min-Seok is using you, Zara, Vane continued, his voice becoming smooth and fatherly. He doesn't care about your brother. He just wants the encryption key. If you give it to him, he'll discard you the moment the money hits his account. Vane walked toward her, stopping just out of arm's reach. He pulled a thick envelope from his inner pocket and set it on the desk. Inside is enough money to get you and your family out of the country tonight. Just tell me where the chip is, and I'll have a car take you to the airport. If you refuse, there's an empty elevator shaft at the end of the hall. No one will find you for a very long time. Zara looked at the money, then at the man who had ordered her brother's death. The pressure in the room felt like a physical weight, but it wasn't the fear that made her hands steady. It was the realization that Vane was afraid. He was negotiating because he was losing control. You're right, Zara said softly, her voice echoing in the quiet office. Choi doesn't care about me, and neither do you. She didn't reach for the money, and she didn't run for the door. Instead, she reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out the small, heavy radio she had snatched from the laundry room earlier. She had already tuned it to the hotel's general security frequency, the one that broadcasted to every earpiece in the building. But the police will care about this, she said. Zara pressed the button. She didn't speak to Vane. She spoke to the chip hidden in her watch, knowing the radio would pick up the high-pitched digital signal of the encryption key. It was a signal that would alert every patrol car within 3 blocks. She wasn't choosing Choi, and she wasn't choosing Vane. She was choosing the one thing neither of them expected, the truth. As the sirens began to wail in the distance, Zara realized there was no going back. She had just set the Grand Seoul on fire. The sirens outside were a muffled hum, but inside the Grand Seoul, the air was vibrating with a different kind of energy. Vane lunged for the radio, his composure finally snapping, but Zara was already out the door. She didn't head for the stairs. She ran toward the ballroom balcony, the place where the hotel's fiber-optic nerve center was hidden behind a decorative velvet curtain. In the ballroom below, the gala was in full swing. Hundreds of elite investors sipped champagne, their diamonds sparkling under the massive chandeliers. They were here to celebrate Vane's newest expansion, unaware that the floor beneath them was built on secrets. Zara reached the control panel. Her fingers, usually used for scrubbing, moved with a different kind of precision now. She didn't need a password, she had the microchip. She pressed her brother's watch against the sensor. The encryption key Leo had died for clicked into place. The music didn't stop, but the giant digital screens surrounding the ballroom flickered. The promotional videos of luxury suites vanished. In their place, the red ledger appeared. Meticulous lists of cargo dates, shipping container numbers, and names of women who had vanished into Vane's network scrolled across the walls. Then the audio from the office played, Vane's own voice admitting that Leo was a fool for having a conscience. The silence that hit the ballroom was heavier than any physical weight. Champagne glasses stopped midair. Zara looked down from the balcony and saw Vane enter the floor, his face turning a ghostly white as he looked up at his own ruin. He wasn't a titan anymore. He was just a man caught in a bright light. Suddenly, the gold-trimmed doors of the ballroom were kicked open. It wasn't the police, not yet. Choi Min-Seok's men moved in with the silence of shadows, wearing tactical gear that bore no markings. They didn't fire a single shot. They simply stood at the exits, blocking Vane's security team from reaching the balcony. Choi walked through the center of the panicked crowd, his eyes fixed on Zara. He didn't look at the screens or the ruined reputation of his rival. He looked at the girl who had done what an entire syndicate couldn't. Zara watched as the investors began to scramble, their status and wealth suddenly useless in the face of the truth. She felt a strange, cold calm. For the first time, she realized that the invisible people like her and Leo were the only ones who actually saw how the world worked. She reached into her pocket, took out the blood-stained ID card, and let it flutter over the railing. It landed on the pristine white tablecloth of the head table. Her work here was done, but as Choi signaled for her to come down, Zara knew she wasn't going back to her old life. She was stepping into the light, and the world was finally going to have to look at her. The grand ballroom was a hollow shell of gold and glass by the time the real authorities arrived. The elite investors had vanished into the night, desperate to distance themselves from the flickering digital evidence still glowing on the screens. Julian Vane didn't fight as the police led him through the lobby. He didn't look like a titan anymore. Without his desk and his security team, he was just a man in an expensive suit that suddenly looked too big for him. He didn't look at Zara as he passed, but she watched him go, her hand resting on the metal of Leo's watch. An hour later, the lobby was silent. The industrial cleaning lights had been turned off, leaving the space in a soft blue twilight. The smell of expensive lilies was gone, replaced by the sharp, clean scent of rain drifting in through the open doors. Choi Min-Seok stood by the central fountain, his shadow long against the marble. He wasn't surrounded by guards this time. He was alone, watching the water rise and fall. Zara walked toward him. Her sneakers didn't squeak, and her head didn't tilt toward the floor. For the first time in 3 years, she wasn't looking for dirt to scrub. "The police have the ledger," Zara said, stopping a few feet away. "And the media has the footage. There is no way for him to buy his way out of this." Choi turned. The intensity in his eyes hadn't faded, but the hardness had shifted into something like curiosity. "You did more than expose a criminal, Zara. You dismantled a network I've been fighting for 2 years. You found the doors that even my best men couldn't see." He reached into his pocket, but he didn't pull out a phone or a weapon. He held out a small, black plastic card. It was a master key, but it didn't belong to the Grand Seoul. It had a simple, embossed crane, the symbol of his private estate. "Vane is gone, but the city is still full of men just like him," Choi said, his voice low and steady. "I don't need someone to clean my floors. I need someone who knows how to be a ghost. Someone who sees the things everyone else ignores." Zara looked at the card. Taking it meant stepping out of the shadows and into a different kind of darkness. It meant trading her cleaning brush for a seat at a table where the stakes were measured in lives, not tips. She thought about Leo's blood-stained ID card and the way the world had looked at her when she was invisible. "I'm not a maid anymore," she said. "I know," Choi replied. Zara took the card. She didn't tuck it into her apron. She put it in her pocket. She turned away from the fountain and walked toward the main entrance. She didn't stick to the edges of the room or hide behind the pillars. She walked straight down the center of the lobby, her footsteps steady and loud on the marble. As she stepped out into the crisp morning air, the sun began to rise over Seoul. The girl who had been ignored was gone, and the woman who held the keys to the city was just getting started.